Hi, welcome to my video on factoring a perfect square trinomial. Perfect squares, we've reviewed this before, but let's go over it again. Perfect squares, 2 squared is 2 times 2, which is 4. 3 squared is 3 times 3, which is 9. 4 squared is 4 times 4, which is 16. Notice when you square a number, the result is a perfect square. 4, 9, 16 are perfect squares. When you square 3x, that's 3x times, I could be brackets, 3x. And that gives me 9x squared. 5x times 5x is 25x squared. And x cubed times x cubed is x to the 6, because when you multiply you add your exponent, or you could do 3 times 2 is 6, or you can multiply it by itself. Notice these are perfect squares because they are a monomial squared. Same as 2 squared, that's 3x squared. So 9x squared, 25x squared, x to the 6 are perfect squares. So what about a binomial squared? So x plus 2 times x plus 2. You multiply by itself. First, outside, inside, last. Add that up. So first, outside, inside, last gives you these. And you add 2x and 2x to get 4. And if you square this one, you can write it down twice. That's what I do. Unless you have a system. So first is x squared, outside is negative 4x, inside is negative 4x, last is plus 16, so that gives you x squared minus 8x. Notice you add these two terms. Again, when you square, we call this what? This is a perfect square, but it's a trinomial now. These are monomials up here. 16, 9, 25x squared, a monomial. But this is a binomial squared, results in, this is a perfect square trinomial. Perfect square trinomial. Why? Because it's a binomial squared. Any number that's square, the result is a perfect square. So if we have a plus b times a plus b, if we multiply this, first is a squared, outside is AB. The inside is BA, but we can also say AB. B times B is B squared. If we add them up, we get an A squared plus 2AB plus B squared. And if you square this one, you get A minus B times A minus B. First is A squared. Outside is negative AB. Inside is negative BA or AB, and negative b times negative b is a positive b squared. When you add negative 1 and negative 1 is a negative 2ab plus b squared. So notice this is also, these are a's and b's now. So if you look back up here, a could be x and b could be 2. Up here, a could be x and b could be negative 3. So this is the pattern for when you square a binomial. A squared plus 2ab plus b squared. Notice the end result here. That's a perfect square. That's a perfect square. And notice the middle. The middle is a and b multiplied, but you double it. And the same here, that's a perfect square. That's a perfect square. And the middle is the a times b doubled, but it's a negative number because it's 2 negatives. It's a negative 2 because there's 2 negatives there. And if you have that pattern and you work this out, then you could, if you square, you could say, well, that's an a squared plus 2ab plus b squared if you want. So if you said that a was x and b was 5, so you could put a is x and b is 5. So there's the a and that's the b. So you put x in the place of a, b, 5 in the place of b. Then you could go, that's an x squared, that's 10x, and that's a 5 squared. So that's the pattern. Or you can multiply it out like we did up here by FOIL. But the pattern, this is a binomial squared, so it's an a squared minus 2ab plus b squared. Again, the a is the x, the b is the negative 6. So a is the x, a is the x, b is the negative 6. So if you write that in, you get that's an x squared, that's a plus 12, a is negative 6, right? Okay, so either or I could have, I got to be careful now, because that's a plus and negative, so I got to be careful. A plus and negative, so if I do it this way, I got to make sure that if I put that plus there, then that's a plus negative, so b is negative 6. So that's a plus. Got to be careful. B is negative 6. So that gives me, that's a negative 12x plus your 36. So when I use this pattern, I have to have a plus sign in the middle. You would say, how come you changed it? Well, this is true here, but that means that b is, if I use this one and do it this way, b is 6. If I do it this way, b is negative 6. By changing it, the b changes from plus 6 to minus 6. So just be careful which way you go. So this one, that's the a, so that's an x squared. This one, that's a plus, so that's a plus. And it's 2 of these multiplied, doubled is 16x. And 8 is 64 when you're squared. So no, because it's a plus, that'll be a plus. And let's do this one. We're going to square it. So it's it's x squared. And you square that, you get 100. And the middle one is the product of these two doubled. Negative 20x. Again, product is doubled. You double, because you're squaring, you multiply these two, that's the a and the b, and you double it. Again, you double it. Why? Because there's 2 of them. Why do you double them? Because there's 2 of them. Why do you double this to an 8? Because there's 2 of them. You add them up, they're the same. So if you take the x and square it, you take the negative 4 and square it, and if you multiply those two, you get a negative 4 and double it, and you get negative 8. That's the fast way of doing it. Okay, that's a perfect square trinomials. This comes from 2 binomials squared. So, perfect square trinomials derived from binomials squared. So it's the same thing again, is that if you multiply all this out, you're going to get an a squared and a b squared, and you multiply them, those two, that's an ab, and it's a plus, and you double it. Product of these two doubled. And if you multiply these two, you get a squared, you get a b squared, and the product of AB is AB, and you double it, negative 2. Because it's a negative, the product of those two is a negative AB doubled, negative 2AB, and the end one is a plus. So notice, you have a perfect square on the end of each, and in the middle, you have a doubled, the product. So the first term is a perfect square. The middle term is twice the product of the terms. And the last one is a b squared. So that's the first term squared. So that's the first term squared. And that's the last term squared. And that's twice the product of the terms with a minus sign or a plus sign. Okay, that's the pattern. A squared plus 2ab plus b squared. If it's a perfect square trinomial coming from a binomial squared. And if there's a negative in the middle, then it's an a squared minus 2ab b squared plus b squared. Is a trinomial a perfect square? To be a perfect square, you have to have a plus. If that's a plus, you're okay to go further. If that's not a plus, you can't go further, because the trinomial has to have a plus on the end and a plus at the beginning. So that's a plus, you're okay. That's a perfect square because it's 6 squared. That's x squared, so that came from x being squared. And notice you have a x and a 6. If you multiply x and 6, you get 6x, and if you double it, you get a 12. So that's a 12. So this is a perfect square trinomial. Yes. And if you factored it, just watch if I factor it. Oops, factor it here. If you factor, you get x and x, and the product is plus 36, so it's a plus and a plus. And 36 to give you 12 is 6 and 6. So that's an x plus 6 squared. So you recognize it. But it has to be a plus on the end. Do I have a plus on the end? Yes, we're okay. We can go further. If we didn't, if that was a minus 25, we would stop and say, no, it's not a perfect square. If this is a perfect square, yes, it comes from 5 squared. If this is a perfect square, it comes from x squared. So if you multiply those two, you get 5x. If you double it, you get 10x. Is that a 10 in the middle? That 10 comes from 5 times x doubled, and it's a negative. So that's a perfect square trinomial. Yes, that's a perfect square trinomial. And if you want to factor it, well, just watch. X and x. And its product is positive, so it's 2 negatives. 25 to give you a 10 is 5 and 5. So that's an x minus 5 squared. So it is a perfect square trinomial. And is this a perfect square trinomial? We have to have a plus. Well, that's the first thing. This is a 4 squared. This is an x being squared. The product of those two is 4x. And if we double it, we get 8x. That's a 4? And the answer is no. Even though they're perfect squares, this is not factorable over the integers. So it's not a perfect square, no. This is a negative 9. So right away I can say no, because it's always a positive at the end. Always a positive on the end. And let's continue. Factor each perfect square trinomial as a binomial. Let's write the word binomial in here. As a binomial. Factor each as a binomial squared. So here we go. If we factor these as a binomial squared, we can check that that's an x and that's a 2, and the product is 2x doubled 4. So this is so if I want, I can go right away. I can say that's an x. The square root of that is a 2, and that's a plus. So x plus 2 squared should give me this. And if you're not convinced, or you think about it, this is a perfect square trinomial because that's a 2 squared. So that's x and x. And it ends at product is plus, so it has to be 2 of the middle signs, 2 pluses. The factors of 4 to give me a 4 are 2 and 2. So that means if you go this way by factoring into 2 binomials and then writing it, because it's 2 binomials multiplied by itself, we can call it a square. So that's the binomial square. So that's a perfect square trinomial. So there's 2 ways to factor these. So if you think about it, is this a perfect square trinomial? That's a 16, and that gives me a 4 and an x, and multiply 4x, double it, 8, plus at the end. So this is, I can write that down just like that. That's an x squared, which is an x. That's a 16, which is a 4, because the 4 squared is 16. And the middle sign is a minus, because you got to multiply those two, which is negative 4x doubled, right? That's the fast way. But if you take your time, x squared is made up of x and x. The product is positive, so it has to be 2 to the middle signs, 2 minuses. The factors of 16, the product is 16, so it's a 1 times 16, 2 times 8, 4 times 4. So which factors add up to give me an 8? 4 and 4. So that's why it's an x minus 4. So you can do it the fast way, or you can do it the long way, but the long way always works. But it's a binomial being squared. C, we have, is it a perfect square trinomial? Well, it ends in a plus, right? That's a 7 squared, and that's an x being squared. And the product of those two is 7x double 14. Yep, it's a perfect square trinomial. So x squared is an x. 49 is a 7 being squared, and it has to have a plus. The product of 7x doubled is 14x. And so there's the factor. And you can do it the way of product and get the sum and write down to 2. Is this one a perfect square trinomial? Well, let's see. That's a 3 being squared. That's an x being squared. The product of those two, the product of x and 3 is 3x double 6x with a minus. So it ends in a plus. Perfect. So the fast way, x squared is x. 9 squared is a 3. And it's a negative. Multiply the two of these, you get negative 3 double, negative 6. Perfect. But it has to be a plus at the end. Or just, you can do it the long way. That is, use the brackets like that. X and x. Product is positive, so it's 2 minuses. Factors of 9 to give you 6, 3 and 3. So that gives you x minus 3 squared. Because you're multiplying by itself. Factor each perfect square trinomial as a binomial being squared. So here we go. A binomial squared. So we can, x squared is x and x. 1 is 1 times 1. And it is a plus in the middle. So x plus 1 squared should give you that. And again, you can do it the long way. You can do it by working it out like that. X and x. And the product is positive 1, so it's a plus and a plus, because the sum is plus. Factors of 1 are 1 and 1. So that's an x plus 1 squared, multiplied by itself. Does it end in a plus? Yes. Is it a perfect square trinomial? Yes. So that's going to be something squared. That's a plus? Perfect. So that's x squared came from an x. 25 came from 5 squared. And if you multiply those two, you get 5x, double is 10, and there's a minus, so it has to be a minus. Is this a perfect square trinomial? That's a plus. Yep. That's a 6 being squared, and that's an x being squared. Good. And 6 times x is 6x, double is 12, so it's a perfect square trinomial. Got to be a plus there. So it's x times x is x squared. 6 times 6 is 36, and if you multiply those two, you get 6, double it is 12, and because that's a plus, that has to be a plus. The middle term, middle sign here tells you what this is going to be. Because the product is positive, this sign got to be 2 pluses, so there's a plus there. It ends in a plus, right? And the square root of x squared is x, square root of 64 is 8, and multiply those two, you get 8, double is 16, so that's a minus 8. Won't you see the pattern? It's a perfect square trinomial. The ends in a plus. Square root of that's a 9. Square root of that's an x. So 9 times x is 9x, double 18. Yes, it's a perfect square trinomial, so we can go x. Square root of 81 is 9, and that's a negative. Multiply those two, negative 9x double. Perfect. Negative 18. Ends in a plus. Yep. X squared gives you an x. 100 gives you a 10. Because 10 squared is 100. X squared is x squared. The product of these two is 10x. Double is 20x. But it has to be a plus, because plus is in the middle. Now, a little bit extra here, but it's the same thing. It's a perfect. That's an x squared, which is an x. That's a 4a, and a 4a is a 2a squared. So that's a 2a. And multiply these two, you get 2ax, and double it, 4ax, and there's a plus. So it's the same pattern, only as an a squared is on the end. Same thing here. We have, is this a perfect square trinomial? Got a plus there, that's the start. That's an x being squared, and that's a 4y being squared. And so that's an x, and that's a 4y. And if you multiply those two, you get 4xy. Double it, it's the 8, and it has to be a minus. So that's the fast way. Again, you can take your time and work them out. So that's a perfect square trinomial. You'll see it again, and that's will come up again in later topics. But keep reviewing it. I keep reminding you what it is, and that's the main thing, if you can recognize it. So hopefully you enjoyed my video. Click the like button. Click the subscribe button if you're not a subscriber. Click the notification bell. Write a comment if you wish if you're a subscriber. And visit my math website, mathfullyexplained.com. 3 sections. Me talks about my degrees and teaching experience. The video section talks about strategies you're going to use to help you learn your math. The content section has the topics and the number of videos on each topic. The black font is what's online right now, and the red font is what I will be doing in the near future. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.